So yeah, welcome to 52 Living Ideas and our discussion on the Gospel of John. Thank you all for coming. As Shrikant mentioned, um, this is a product of my master's thesis, and the issue that I ran into, or the part that I was tackling, was something very simple. Was that we see the command to love one another as I have loved you, um, to love your neighbor as yourself, coupled with, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind, all your soul. Um, we see it in every gospel, all four of the gospels. We see it in the Gospel of John. It's in the Pauline letters. It's in the epistles of John. It's in James. It's a theme that permeates throughout the entire Old Testament. It was also already an established norm. I think I talked in a previous one about the Rabbi Hillel. When a proselyte came to him and says, "I'll convert to Judaism if you can recite to me all the Torah while standing on one foot." And so he stands on one foot and he says, "That which is loathsome to you, do not do to anyone else." And then puts his foot down and says, "The rest is details. Now go study." And so you have this, the summation of the command to love, since, that was 100 years, some in the period before even Christianity, before even, the incarnation, that was already the accepted norm. Um, and so I was, in my Christian walk, encountered some cognitive dissonance with this command to love and the way many Christians actually behaved. And so so today's presentation is really a focus on that problem. And it's really easy. I was just talking with Shrikant about it. It's really easy to point the finger and just complain the whole time. And so I'm trying not to go through the subject material with a heavy hand, but I also want to be as academic and data driven as possible, and to kind of look at the matter as objectively as possible. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start the presentation and we'll go through this. If you have a pen and paper, um, feel free to take some notes. I have a couple of slides where I just have some questions to think about. And so you might, want to jot down like your response to these questions as we go through. Um,
Folks, I just want to tell you that Gary covers a lot during this, and deliberately, we're not going to take questions in the middle because we want that entire thought to come down. So please use pen and paper to keep track of all the questions that you have. We'll have plenty of time afterwards to deal with all the questions. All right. Go ahead.
all right. So we'll start off with, I was kind of working on a theory. And right here we have the quote from Tertullian, which is really famous, especially in academic circles. Everybody memorizes this at what point. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What does the church have to do with the state? Um, and so I kind of walked with this theory as like, how dynamic was Christianity before and after Constantine? Is it a clear shift? And I didn't want to read assumptions into the text or into history. I didn't want to bring my own opinion into it. And so it was really difficult, because even though I was operating on this assumption, I really kind of wanted to look at the scholars and see what they had to say. So here we are. This is what I got, and we'll go forward with that. Um, this is something new that I found out. Before Constantine, before the Edict of Milan, before the Nicene Council, you have something called the Synod of Elvira in Spain. And here's one of the canons from it. It says, if someone has smashed idols and has been condemned to death for doing so, since this is not written in the gospel, nor is it found ever to have been done by the apostles, he shall not be included in the ranks of the martyrs. And I bring this up as a contrast, is that in early Christianity, there was so much zeal for Christ that people saw it as a privilege to be martyred. And so, when we think of persecution in our modern, it's like, oh, we don't want to see it. We want to avoid it. We pray for the martyrs and the persecuted people. But there was a sense in which, like, to bear Christ's burdens, to bear the scars. We see this in Acts, when the apostles, come out of jail and they like glorifying the fact that they got to suffer for Jesus. You see it at the end of John when it talks about Peter's, prophesies Peter's death. And, it says that, Jesus spoke these words talking about the way that Peter would glorify the gospel, bring glory to Jesus, through his death, the death that would bring glory. And so people really did see that. And sometimes they had this inappropriate zeal of going into temples and smashing idols just to get in trouble. And it was enough of a problem that the council convened and had this intervention. Important, it's not an ecumenical synod, not like Nicaea was. It was local. It's the first synod where we have like really detailed records. We have records of other councils that happened throughout the Christian Empire, a bunch of them in Carthage. And of course, Cyprian, took a lot of notes on there. I have a little notice on that. But this is the first one where we really kind of have a whole long list of it, and it's a lot of detail. And so it's historically very significant. It's going to come up again later in this discussion. Well, in 312, we have the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and Constantine sees this sign in the heavens, the Chi Rho, and he affixes this Chi Rho to the shields of his troops. And he has this vision that says, "En hoc signo vinces," in this sign ye shall conquer. Constantine wins the battle, and as a result, he pronounced something called the Edict of Milan in 313, and it's an edict of toleration for all religions. And this becomes really significant. Lactinius, or I can't even say his name properly. He advocated for a religious reform, and he makes this. If you look at it, he influenced the Edict of Milan. A lot of his thought went into it. He's a lesser known church father. I didn't even know who he was until I started looking this up. If you look at it, it says there's no need for force and injury because religion cannot be forced. It's a matter that must be managed by words rather than blows, so that it may be voluntary. The will can be moved to act only by words, not by blows. Religion is to be defended not by putting to death, but by dying, not by cruelty, but by patient endurance, not by guilt, but by good faith. And this kind of reflects the sentiment of Christianity, especially Christianity under persecution, where the argument was, can you just please let us worship in peace? We're not an enemy of the Roman Empire. We're not disloyal people. We're good citizens. Let us practice and we'll continue to be good citizens. Historian, this guy H.A. Drake says the edict constitutes a landmark in the evolution of Western thought, not because it gives legal standing to Christianity, which it does. And in school, this is what, one of the big things that they focused is that Edict of Milan made Christianity, made it safe to practice. And they don't always focus on this aspect of it. It's the first official government document in the Western world to recognize the principle of freedom of belief. And so it spread throughout. It wasn't just allowing Christianity to be practiced, but it was an edict of toleration for all religions. And so this becomes a very, really significant thing. And here's the big however. Constantine was still a Roman emperor, and the Roman emperor is the high priest of the Roman imperial religion. And the high priest of Roman imperial religion has certain duties. One of them is their job is, before any state functions, before any battles, before anything happens, their job is to seek omens, to seek oracles, to petition the gods, and you don't do anything without a favorable omen. And so this, vision that Constantine has, where he sees the key road, and he sees this message before he goes into battle, it's really significant. Whether it happened or not, it was a necessary was a necessary event for the Roman state religion, that whatever the general can't go into battle until he consults the gods. And there's also significance in the ways that they petition the gods and what kinds of signs they seek, which rituals are passed, and it's very significant that it's a sign in the air. And so this is a big deal. So when Constantine does this, he's making a very, as the high priest, is making a very theological assertion about Christianity and the will of the gods writ large, not just the Christian God. You'll see that one of the third bullet points is the emperor preserves something called the Pax Deorum. As high priest of the Roman religion, the job of the high priest, of the emperor, was to make certain that there is a peace with the gods, because there is still this fatalistic understanding of, the gods rule the universe. There's all these cosmic things that are involved in this, and it's important that we stay on the good side of the gods. Defeats and bad things that happen are considered, injuries against the gods in some way, and so this role that he has, it wasn't being shirked. Lots of times we look at Constantine's conversion to Christianity at this point and say it's like, oh, now we have a Christian empire. He's still functioning very much like the Roman state religion at this moment, and I guess that's my big thing that I want to grill in there. And here's our big question, just kind of to think about it. In Rome, the favor of gods was sought through oracles and state functions. Everything required favorable omens. How did Constantine's role as Pontificus Maximus affect the early theology of the Christian church? And so, that's something that I ponder a lot. And in my mind, the idea of this quid pro quo divine sanction, I don't know to what degree that has influenced the way we function in the world now. But that's definitely something to ponder. I definitely see what I would say sometimes in my conversations with certain Christians, almost a type of superstition, with prayer practices and ritualism, and that makes me think of that. All right, the impact of Christianity on paganism, this anti-paganism. So beginning with Constantine, we started off with this edict of toleration that extended to all religions. But then in about the 330s, shortly after the Council of Nicaea, Constantine orders temples to be shut down or stripped, for idols to be melted down, for pagan shrines to be cleared. Significantly, he built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, so you can still go to Jerusalem, and presumably his mother had gone to a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, found holy artifacts. I believe she came back with nails from the cross, if I recall correctly. And there's a joke that said that if we had all the pieces of the cross that people have corrected through the ages, we could build many churches with all the wood that has been revered as relics from the cross of Christ, because so many people claim to have nails and pieces of wood from it. At about this time, we start to see at the end of, middle to the end of the 4th century, mob actions of Christians against pagans. There's an increase of it. The Temple of Apollo gets destroyed. This is during the reign of Julian, sometimes referred to as Julian the Apostate. Julian was tried to reinstitute old Roman religion. He's kind of took a switch, and he tried to do not so much to re-persecute Christianity, but he saw that the pagan religions were being persecuted at this time, with the destruction of temples and this mob act, and so he was trying to bring back the old Roman ways. And so in that respect, he ended up blaming the Christians for this destruction, and that's speculative to what degree the Christians were at fault for that one. 380s, monks and village Christians tore down rural temples in Syria. And then you have the pagan philosopher Libanius begging the emperor Theodosius to stop them. And it looks historically that the emperor might have even been sympathetic towards him. But then other church fathers intervened, and tried to curry favor with the emperor, said, no, 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 carry on. So yeah, by the 390s, we have the destruction of the Serapeum. This is a significant pagan temple, a Christian mob led by Theophilus. It was a deliberate act of religious violence aimed at demonstrating Christian dominance. And so what began as, state actions, and a not necessarily, I don't know how to describe it. It just grew in intensity. And at some point, by the time you get to the 390s, you have different, mobs of Christians feeling empowered, to riot and destroy temples. And so here's a question. We see this transition, the early church before Constantine asking for tolerance, just saying, can we all just get along? Can you allow us to practice our religion? And within 100 years, you have mobs destroying things. So my question is tolerance versus intolerance, is this a Christian legacy that still endures? Is this something that we inherited and that still continues? 314 CE, so this is shortly after the Edict of Milan. The Council of Arles, not an ecumenical council, local council, it condemns Christians who abandoned military service. Whereas earlier, Christian writers like Tertullian and Origen previously forbade military service. There was this strong pacifistic attitude towards the military. Ambrose of Milan and Augustine of Hippo, they start to develop just war theory. And that still continues to this day when we talk about whether or not Christians should go to war, whether or not war can ever be justified. To this day, they refer to Ambrose and Augustine for their arguments. We have this incorporation of Christian symbolism and military standards, like we mentioned, the Key Road, the Knights Templar with the cross, and also, victories, very similar to what was going on in Rome, is, victories are attributed to divine favor that was sought. And so, again, the impact of militarism. When I looked into it, there's definitely the influence of the Protestant Reformation and the wars that ensued between Protestant and Catholics kind of led to this fatigue. There were so many wars over religion throughout Europe that these wars laid the background to the Enlightenment. Whether or not they motivated the Enlightenment or what degree that contributed to it is hotly debated, because the Enlightenment had so many different contributing factors. But certainly the background of all this fatigue over that led people to really consider: is it possible that we can just establish a society that isn't rooted in religion? Can we even have one that is just tolerant of all religions? Can Protestants and Catholics even get along? And I have my question there: is it possible to envision a Christianity without war? In my own experiences, if I bring up the notion of pacifism, sometimes in casual conversation, it's interesting how much how angry people get. People get very opinionated on that. And it might be because, war and military service has been equated with Christian values for so long that it almost feels like a betrayal. I don't know. Morality. This book, From Shame to Sin by Kyle Harper, is a good one. I got this one quite a while ago. Was working on using this as one of my sources when I was looking through my thesis. Specifically, what stood out to me was Christians early on, had a strong aversion for homosexual acts. And not so much that is like early on they embraced celibacy, and so sexual purity writ large was a big emphasis of Christianity. And so what we see is early on, like by the late 300s and 400s, not just is it forbidden, but we start seeing execution and castration or some forms of mutilation for certain sexual offenses. And that to me is kind of what stood out. It's one thing, to object to somebody's lifestyle. It's quite another thing to call in the law and then to engage in corporal punishment, even the death penalty for certain things. Rape, sexual violence, became more likely punishment. Adultery was punished more so often, whereas in the past it was kind of ignored. I think it was technically illegal in the Roman Empire, but it was just kind of never one of those laws that was never really enforced. Prostitution is well attested in the Roman Empire throughout, definitely tolerated, if not encouraged. And then we start to see laws against that. Same thing with infanticide and abortion, previously tolerated. It happened. And then as Christian influence came in, we start to see laws being passed. Common punishment was people would lose their inheritance, if they were convicted of a crime like this. There could be other forms of criminal punishment like imprisonment. And this brings us, to the big question is, what is the role of law in society? And in my paper, one of the things I really question is like, are we polluting the gospel when we establish a Christian state? When we start punishing people for the way they act, especially corporal punishment, imprisoning people, confiscating their property, things like that. What does that do to the Christian message? What does that do to the gospel message? The impact of Christian of women, the role of women. This is significant. Well known. Many of the church fathers will talk about Romans 16:7, where Paul in his letter at the end is giving his typical greetings, and it's really significant is how many women Paul mentions throughout his different epistles, and that's a big clue as to how many women were just in the church. I'm just thinking of typical letters of greetings in modern churches, where we're just like, oh, say hello to so and so and so. It's all men. But when you go looking at Paul's epistles, there's so many women that it's like obvious that women had a prominent role. And then he identifies what those roles are. And specifically, I bring this up as Junia is called an apostle. So here we have a woman on par with Paul himself and Peter and the 12 apostles. And the early church fathers talk about it as like, imagine what an amazing woman this was that Paul refers to her. Paul, the apostle Paul, refers to her as an apostle. At this time, early on, women were patrons, hosts of house churches. When we say patrons, they had wealth and funded the church. They were deacons, teachers, catechists, ascetics, benefactors, and even martyrs. And many of these roles are attested in the New Testament, especially in Acts. And we see Paul even mentioning it in his letters. Early on, there became a shift, clericalization and episcopal control as the church started creating hierarchies and we started having, a bishop and then deacons and elders and all these things going on. Men became appointed to some of these more prominent roles. And then we kind of see like almost a reestablishment of the hierarchies that were there, already in the Roman Empire. Because it was a very stratified empire. Men were certainly on top, women were on the bottom. And if there's some sexual overtones in that statement, that's intentional. That's one of the reasons why homosexuality was frowned upon, as it's inappropriate, it's improper for a man to be in that submissive role. And so homosexual acts were certainly frowned upon because they were degrading of the status of men. Men are supposed to be on top. They are the penetrators. They are the dominant people in this. And so there's a very hierarchical role between men and women. I bring that up because Christianity seemed to have like leveled a lot of that status when we look at the early role of women. And by the time we get to even before Constantine in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the 200s going into the 300s, we see, kind of a retraction, of going back to women, resuming their roles in Roman Empire. Significantly, and this is the one that stood out for me, is, there were punishments for adultery, but if you're a woman, you could potentially be executed. That's again, a status thing. Men aren't going to be executed for adultery. They might be punished. It's frowned upon, but if you're a woman, you certainly can be. So again, this leads us to another question. What is the traditional biblical role of women? Um, this is a debate that people make all the time, and especially on social media, you have these like trad wives and these stay-at-home mothers, and this, very hierarchical thing. In some evangelical circles, they have this picture of this umbrella where you have the father is the top, and immediately underneath, it's this series of umbrellas is, then you have the wife and the mother and the children and society, and everything just kind of like trickles down underneath it. But it's definitely a reestablishing of hierarchies. Um, but when we look at the early church, when we look at the New Testament, um, I think we see a very, that's something to really consider, is the traditional role and biblical role of women something more prominent than we acknowledge now. Um, Here's a very touchy thing, is anti-Judaism. And again, as I was looking at things, from a pre-Constantine perspective, an early perspective, and as you go later, you can see kind of this evolution of, of thought and belief and practice. But when we get here, you don't so much. It's specifically called anti-Judaism in its earliest stages, because the arguments that Christians had with Jews were strongly theological. And most scholars will argue that we don't see racism per se against Jews, not in the way that we conceptualize that now. And so they distinguish between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. The targeting of Jewish people, theologically, and you'll see this in the Epistle of Barnabas and the writings of Justin Martyr, Ignatius, Tertullian, Origen. They have this real strong theological objection. Sometimes they'll even speak rudely, calling Jews ignorant people who have rejected Christ, who don't understand who their own Savior, their own God is. That veil is on there. And again, it's like their focus here is theological. But then you get to stuff back to the Council of Elvira, the same one that talked about forbidding people to desecrate idols. You begin to see stuff that is probably a little bit more explicitly anti-Semitic, where we forbid marriage with Jews. We forbid the clergy from eating with Jews. We see the Jews being targeted behaviorally, not necessarily objects of violence, but we're starting to see regulations on how Christians are allowed to interact with them. After Constantine, the state begins to codify decrees that are comparable to Elvira. We start to see, Christians being, told, no, don't eat with Jews, don't marry Jews. You start to see mob attacks on synagogues. I put a little star there because, again, initially when this happened, many of the Roman empires were kind of like had alarms on it. And at one point, I think in this one, there's Theodosius repaired the synagogue and demanded that the church, go back and fix it. But again, that didn't stop this from happening further on down the road. In the 4th and 5th centuries, there were limits to the building of new synagogues, limits to offices that the Jews could have. And here we have more explicitly anti-Semitic, legislation. And then in the 600s, you have like the King of Spain ordering all Jews to convert or leave. And so that's with the church. This attitude towards Judaism seems to be with the church from the beginning. When you look at the Epistle of Barnabas, we're looking at quite possibly a 1st century or very early 2nd century document. So here we have groundskeeper Willie from the Symptoms. No true Scotsman I bring this up because this is like the argument you're almost gonna, I say you, but I hear so frequently, especially in apologetics, whenever you bring up something unsavory about Christianity or the past, they'll say, well, they weren't true Christians who did all that. Um, and this is a quote by scholar Jennifer Nust. And this was kind of like in the very beginning, like page 1 or page 2 of my thesis. She contends that the love command was not and is not now a reliable prophylactic against hatred, violence, and disregard. Is that the church from the earliest time has had the love command. They inherited the love command from Jewish Talmudic thought, and it did not stop it. It did not stop, kind of the attitudes that the church has towards other people. And so again, be wary when we discuss these things of people saying, no true Christian would ever agree on all this. And I think that that's not true. Um, Historically, varying degrees of violence, misogyny, racism, and intolerance have always been part of the mainstream church. And this is the other thing, I brought this up just a little bit. Are pacifism and nonviolence outliers? How often do you see that? And what pops in my head is during the Protestant Reformation, so many different factions broke away from the Catholic Church. And you had lots of big push towards pacifism. And, the early Baptists, called themselves Anabaptists, many of which were pacifist. They were targeted by both the Protestants and the Catholics. Nobody nobody could abide to let a pacifist live. And so they were slaughtered. And because they were pacifists and held so strongly to their faith, oftentimes they didn't defend themselves. And so, towns and people were just wholesale, just wiped out. Back to the love command. Slavery, our legacy of slavery. Jennifer Nust brought this up, and this was really kind of significant. Is there's this 1845 Ohio debate, pre-Civil War. Is slaveholding in itself sinful? And the relationship between master and slave, is this a sinful relationship? And so you have these two guys, Reverend Rice on the left, Reverend Bull on the right, and both of them are arguing from the very same biblical text, which is the love of neighbor. And so they're both preaching the same thing. Is it to love your neighbor? What does that have to say about slavery? And the guy on the left is arguing that the best way to love your neighbor is to buy slaves and to own them and give them good Christian masters. And that, we're civilizing people and giving them culture and giving them a better life than they ever could have by being slaveholders. Whereas on the right, you have Reverend Blanchard saying just the opposite, that slavery is inherently wrong. And it's, there's no way you can justify that, call this love. Again, there's a tension within Christianity, even in how we interpret the text. Back to war. Here we have both Vladimir Putin and Martin Luther quoting the same text from the Bible. Vladimir Putin on the anniversary of Russia's annexation of Crimea gave a speech, and he quotes John 15. He says, I remember the words from the Bible, there's no other love rather than if someone gives their soul for their friends. Every time we have, Veterans Day, Memorial Day, church friends, military friends, they will quote John 15. They will quote this verse, and with reference to the military. And, I always, recoil when I see that or when I hear that, and I have a hard time speaking up because I don't know how appropriate it would be. But when Jesus said this, he's looking at the cross and he's literally about to give his life. When they come for him in the garden, he says, here I am, you came for me, let these others go. He gives his life for his friends. He goes to the cross. He says to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it was of this world, my servants would be fighting for me. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this world. There is no violence implied when Jesus said, no greater love has anyone that he'll give his life for his friends. And so when the military takes this, this verse out of John 15 and appropriates it, it hurts me. It seems like it's egregiously out of context. Martin Luther a Lutheran pastor recommended that I read Martin Luther's Can Soldiers Too Be Saved? And in that, where he talks about, he says, now slaying and robbing do not seem to be works of love. A simple man, therefore, does not think it is a Christian thing to do. In truth, however, even this is a work of love. Talking about, going to war and re-envisioning war as an act of love. So yeah, what really kind of inspired me to focus on this topic for my thesis wasn't pacifism, wasn't war, wasn't just cause, wasn't the Crusades or a lot of this historical stuff. It was scandal after scandal in the modern church, especially among evangelical churches, evangelical Christians. And here I have just three of them, but like the list is endless. And I targeted these three are evangelical churches. Like if we open it up and talk about Catholic churches and Episcopal churches and Reformed churches and go over, it's just like again and again and again. It's like every week there's another one. What stands out the most for me in all of these is the cover up of abuse by these organizations. It's a recurring theme. And what we don't have a lot of examples of, I wish those were outliers. I wish when there was abuse, the church just came and fessed up to it and said, hey, we did something wrong. We're going to get rid of this pastor. We're going to set up guardrails. We're going to set up protocols. We're going to fix this. We're going to offer counseling, to the victims. We're going to try to remedy this and go back. We're going to repent and look like Christ. But no, 2025 Gateway Church, concealment of sexual abuse by the church concealed the sexual abuse by their youth leader. Champion Forest Church, also in 2025, women were abused as minors. And again, the pastors mishandled the whole investigation and interfered with the police investigation, actually tried to stop it. The big one is in 2019, the Southern Baptist Convention. It's the largest evangelical denomination, 700 victims, 380 accused clergy over a 20-year time span. And the denomination had a hidden list of offenders, that they were moving around and protecting for all of this length of time. This one is I'm drawing attention to this one because a gentleman, his name was Russell Moore, along with a bunch of other people. He was in charge of ethics at the Southern Baptist Convention, and he tried really hard to be the whistleblower in all of this. And so they had an independent investigation where all of this came out. That was followed up by a federal investigation. And the reason why I bring this up is I have since then talked to Baptists who are affiliated with this denomination. And when I bring up this matter, I'm told that Russell Moore is a money greedy charlatan, and that the federal investigation didn't come up with anything. And so again, it's like even after all of these years and after all this going on, they're still trying to hide it up and purge it. When I went to the Turning Point Convention, I met with another member of this, and I brought this up. I says, well, you guys had some of the speakers had some very not kind things to say about other Christian denominations, and I brought up this matter. And the guy really got really aggressive with me, and again, he called this man a charlatan, said I didn't know it. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a little worked up a little bit because like I felt like I was being gaslit. I had researched this and then had a conversation with somebody who told me that I didn't know what I was talking about. So I went and researched it again to make certain I was right. And then I had this conversation with a guy, and he again told me I didn't know what I was talking about and that it was all overblown. So every time I had a conversation, I was like, well, am I not getting this? And so I researched it again. I was like, no, this is exactly what happened. I can't get people to just acknowledge that it was happened, say that it was wrong, and say, okay, let's fix it. It's there's a lot of minimization that goes on. This is just a chart of hate crimes, specifically anti-Jewish hate crimes. We could do charts for, other race crimes. We could do charts for, things that target LGBTQ communities. But, as you can see, there's a huge spike, especially in recent years. A spike that goes up in 2016, kind of goes up and down for a little while. And then in the last few years, I don't know what the numbers are right now. I did hunt a little bit for that. It seems like it's still going up. But as you can see, it's like double what it was, 5 or 6 years ago. Here we have communist Jesus, the revolutionary. And we're getting kind of towards the end of this thing. I have this picture here because more and more what's happening is that when we talk about social programs, especially in evangelical circles, the mainstream is that giving to charity, especially to the poor, to the homeless and whatnot, is seen as enabling people. And so there's actually a movement to stop giving to charity. And this seems to be like contrary. In our last lecture that we did, we talked about how hospitals, poorhouses, orphanages, leprosy places, academic institutions, care for widows, care for the elderly. I mean, the list goes on of all the things that Christianity, things that we take for granted now, but had their roots, have Christian origins. How much of just the whole notion of charity in Western culture, the welfare state, especially as it's practiced in Europe, with healthcare and education for people, how much of that is grounded in Christian values. And here in the United States, we see like an aggressive opposition to that. So it begins in the 17th and 18th century as Protestants start to object to Elizabethan poor laws. So this is the state, trying to do stuff, and Christians opposing state welfare. And then you have in the 19th century Protestants saying that the giving of charity dilutes evangelism, takes away from it. And then in the 20th century, conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists began objecting to social programs, seeing the welfare state as status and a rival to the church's mission. And then finally, it's now people are saying that it's unbiblical, un-American. And you'll actually see people calling it Christian Marxism. And when they talk about liberalism and cultural Marxism, they're almost always talking about the state intervening in some sort of charitable thing, charitable, way. And so these arguments about small government are usually grouped around this topic right here, or this retraction from government. They certainly don't want government intervention, but lots of times it's targeted towards social programs. And then finally, that's kind of disturbing me now, is these are two books that are out there that have made the rounds. Toxic Empathy and the Sin of Empathy, that to have compassion is being viewed as a sin and as a weakness, and to have compassion as a perversion of the gospel of Christ, that is certainly floating around. I don't like, in both of these books, they'll say something that, we don't know that, empathy necessarily is wrong in and of itself, but it's certainly being abused. And then once they start breaking it down, it is. It's to me an abandonment of Christ's compassion that he had. And so here we are, last two slides. What's the main point? The main point of my thesis isn't like to give people another set of rules. This is why I like the Gospel of John, is that, Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you abide in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. It's that simple. It's not about what would Jesus do. I think it's who would Jesus have us be. That's some inner character transformation. And I don't think he's calling us to have less empathy or less compassion for people in this fallen world. And so, here I have just a bunch of questions. You don't have to write them all down, but, what is the controversy? Things that used to be the standard, that were, part of Christianity at the root of the gospel, are now becoming controversial. Like, what if we stopped being political? It used to not be political. What if we stopped opposing war? or what if we, what if we did oppose war? There used to be a time when Christians opposed war. Loving your neighbor used to be this all-inclusive thing. This notion of empathy wasn't an issue, before. It was something that was part and parcel to what it means to have the Christian message. What if Christianity looked like Jesus? And so that's all I have.
Thank you, Gary. All right, so folks, now, any questions, any comments, everything is welcome. So just go ahead and raise your hand in Zoom or type an exclamation mark in the chat to either ask questions or make comments.
I will add, one little thing is that many of these transitions, many of these changes were very gradual. One of the things I looked up is when did heretics, at what point did the church start to say that we're going to punish heresy? Early on, and you see this in the New Testament, is if somebody is a heretic, if somebody's disrupting the church, then we ask them to leave. We separate from them. But we don't punish them. We don't hurt them. We don't confiscate their property or anything like that. Around the 400s, there was an incident where somebody was executed. And there was actually a lot of blowback. The church kind of as a whole rallied and said, for all the things that are going on here, as bad as this guy was, we don't want to get to the point where we kill people or we engage in this level of violence. And so then there was this long pause, between the 400s till the 1000s, so 600 years. There was no violence against heretics. And then around the 1000s, you see it picks up again at that point. And again, as I think that it's because the church at this time just was so intertwined with the state that, heresy became a challenge to power. And so then you have, following that, the Inquisition, more stuff like that. But for a long time, the church, was reluctant to have a heavy hand, a violent hand like that.